It's 8 o'clock.
Yes. So we'll start.
Yes.
Yeah. Hello and very good evening to all participants and wonderful morning to Professor Ken Light, who is joining with us from United States. On behalf of the Jagran Lakecity University, Faculty of Journalism and Creative Studies, I humbly welcome you all to this wonderful and excited session. First of all, I would like to extend a special and warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Professor Ken Light, a brilliant social documentary photographer, prolific writer, and author of several books. His brilliant photographic work exhibited worldwide and also part of museum collection in different parts of the world. He is also a recipient of several photography fellowship and awards. Presently, he is working as a professor at Center for Photography at the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California, Berkeley, United States. Thank you, Professor Ken Light, for accepting our invitation in a very short notice. Before we move to our speaker, I would like to give you a brief idea about our photography club. It is purely student-driven initiative, and our prime objective is to develop critical thinking skill among our budding journalists and foster good collaboration with the leading universities and developing good connection with the top photographer and photojournalist of the world. We invite eminent photographer for a dialogue and try to understand their life journey, their challenges, and their success mantra, which inspire our young minds and future budding journalists. So this mission is a step towards fulfilling our objective. Without delaying further, I would like to request my colleague, Professor Sardar Bhargav, to formally introduce our speaker and moderate the session. Over to you, Professor Sardar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the welcome note. Good evening, one and all. I'm Shraddha Bhargava, and I'm part of the Faculty of Journalism and Creative Studies at Jagran Lakecity University, Bhopal. Thank you, Professor Light, for accepting the invitation and taking out your valuable time for this session. Now, I would like to give a brief introduction about our esteemed guest of honor, Professor Ken Light. Professor Light is a Guggenheim Fellow, Reva and David Logan Professor, and Curator of the Center of Photography at the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Light is recipient of numerous prestigious grants. To name few are National Endowment for the Arts NEA, Photographers Fellowship, Dorothea Lang Fellowship from the Erna and Victor Hasselbalch Foundation, as well as grants from the Soros Open Society Institute, the American Film Institute, the California Arts Commission, and International Fund for Concerned Photography. Professor Light is also the author of 11 monographs, including Midlight La Frontera, Course of Empire, Texas, and is mostly recently published What's Going On, 1969-1974. The list goes on, and if I continue this, even a day won't be enough. Today, Professor Light would be talking about his experience and journey traveling through United States of America and photographing the social landscape. To mention here, the participants will be allowed to ask questions in the last 20 minutes. I would request all participants to mute yourself so that there's no interruption in between. Now, with due respect, I would request Professor Light to take the session forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and good evening to all of you. It's great to have an international connection. Photography is a language that we all understand, and there are wonderful, brilliant photographers in India photographing your own world. My own career has been about my own country. As most of you know, the voice and the politics of America is often about looking at other countries and telling other countries what to do, and we often don't look into our own backyard. And so I've spent my career as a photographer over 50 years photographing the United States, because we have many unseen problems here that much of the world doesn't know about, and even my own countrymen don't know about. So I'm going to take you through some of my influences as a photographer, and then talk about my most recent project, which is called Course of the Empire. That is a book that's about to be published by Steitel. And so let me share my screen. Go. Great. So I'm going to be talking about traveling across the United States and photographing the social landscape, but I really wanted to start by talking about photography. I always start my lectures with my students with this photograph, which is the first photograph in the history of photography, 1826 by Joseph Niepce. He used a pewter plate covered with a mixture of bitumen and water. He put the plate inside a camera, and over many hours, perhaps 2 days, the light hardened bitumen on the plate showed a view of the courtyard. The unhardened parts were washed away to produce the image. And if you look closely on the left, you can see the faint outlines of where the courtyard is. And actually on the right shows you the actual photograph. We moved into other types of photography, the daguerreotype in 1839. We had photographers actually going out into the world and bringing us the world, which is kind of hard for us to fathom, given that here I am and you all are in India and we're talking. It's hard to imagine the experience of viewing historical images that photographers went and brought back from places that people could not even imagine. There are many photographers who really influenced my work. Jacob Riis, one of the early, a Danish immigrant who came to America, one of the early photographers of the social landscape in the United States. Louis Hine, considered by me to be the father of social documentary photography, who photographed the arrival of immigrants in America and also looked at the problems of child labor in America, which in the early 1900s were allowed, and progressives were trying to end the idea of child labor. Paul Strand, who's moved us into the modernist era of photography. His photograph Wall Street on the left and The Blind Beggar on the right were instrumental in how we began to see photography as modern. Of course, the great social documentary photographer, Dorothea Lang, best known for her work during the American Great Depression in the 1930s. Her famous photograph on the right, The Migrant Mother, considered probably one of the greatest photographs of documentary in the history of photography. In 1925, 1926, we had this incredible invention. Oscar Barnack created the Leica #1, the first small 35mm camera, which then allowed photographers, particularly documentary photographers, to go much, much deeper into the world. We have the great French photographer, Henri Cartier-Bresson, and his powerful photograph of India. He did many, many reportage, as most of you know, throughout India as part of in his career. We have Robert Capa, photographed from the Spanish Civil War. Helen Levitt, the American street photographer. We have in America the creation of Life magazine, and we have one of the great photographers, Gordon Parks, who photographed, the photograph on the right was an image looking at segregation in the United States in the 1950s, particularly in the American South. Of course, we have Robert Frank.
Professor, you are muted. Can you please unmute yourself?
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Of course, Robert Frank, the Swiss photographer, came to America in the 1950s with a vision of what was going on in the United States and created the book, The Americans. Oops, go back. Sorry, there we go. Two of Robert Frank's most famous photographs from The Americans. We have W. Eugene Smith, the great photo essayist, photographs from the Spanish village. We have Danny Lyons, who photographed extensively the American Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, and also bike riders and many other important documentary stories. Bruce Davidson in the 1970s, East 100th Street. Joseph Kudelka, the Gypsies. Diane Arbus. Gary Winogrand, the great street photographer. I mean, this all led me as a young photographer at 18 years old in 1969 to begin photographing my own world, and most recently publishing this book called What's Going On, My Early Photographs. And this was a time of social upheaval in America, fighting against the Vietnam War. And as a young photographer, at 18, I went out with my, at this time, 35mm camera and began to photograph the world around me. And this included political upheaval. These are protests in 1970 against the Cambodia invasion. And shortly after these pictures were taken, students were shot and killed on the campus of Kent State University. I continued photographing and began to look at many different social issues in America. This is my earliest book, With These Hands, with a preface by Cesar Chavez, the organizers of the farm workers, looking at the issue of agricultural workers in America. A book called To the Promised Land that looked at immigration in the United States, people coming primarily at this time from Mexico illegally into the US to work, to find work. A book called Delta Time about the conditions of the Afro-American community in the Mississippi Delta. This is a river baptism. A book on Texas death row, looking at the life of men who have been sentenced to be executed in Texas, where I spent weeks inside the prison, photographing the men. At that time, there were about 360 men on death row, and this project was done in 1994, and since then, I would say about 80 of the men I photographed were executed by the state. I wrote a book called Witness in Our Time, if you want to learn more about documentary photography, that included many important social documentary photographers across the world, including Dayanita Singh, the Indian photographer, and Sebastio Salgado, and Mary Ellen Mark, and Graciela Interbede, and Donna Ferrato, and many, many other photographers. I then went out into the Appalachian region and photographed and did a book called Coal Hollow about rural Appalachia and the communities that had been affected by the mechanization of coal and what their world was now like. A book that I did with my wife called Valley of Shadows and Dreams that looks at California, the California Central Valley, which is the largest agricultural producing area of California, of the United States, and the lives and the conditions of this area, looking at pesticides and industrial agriculture, and at that time, the Great Recession, where people were thrown out of work and the conditions in which people faced. My most recent book is a redux of my work that I did in the 1980s, and that is called Midnight La Frontera, which looks at the work that I did, particularly at night at the border, the American border, and the apprehensions of people who are trying to come in illegally into the United States. So now I'll go into traveling across America. And this is my most recent work done over the last 11 years, called Course of the Empire. It's about to be published by Steidl, the German publisher. And my motivation of doing this work was looking at what's happening to America. And while America likes to portray itself as this incredibly powerful and dynamic and healthy country, I was really beginning to feel that the American empire as many people see us, particularly when we point to other countries and tell them what to do. We overthrow countries, we give money, we take money, our military is all over the world. I began to see and feel that America was falling apart. And this was evidenced to me by this great income inequality that was happening. I mean, you have people that are millionaires and billionaires. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where Silicon Valley is located. And it was not unusual for companies to go public on the stock market. And all of a sudden you have these young people, 24, 25 years old, becoming millionaires overnight. And you're talking about thousands and thousands of them. And of course we have billionaires. And the middle class and the lower class in America were worst off, and the conditions were really changing. And people were not really concerned with this issue. So I felt my job as a photographer was to go out and look at this issue and try to visualize this story. It started out basically just traveling around America. My first trip was to Detroit, and from Detroit I drove through Indiana and Illinois and into Mississippi and Arkansas and Kentucky. I spent time in New York. I went to Florida. I photographed in California, in Oregon. I mean, literally all over the United States. And my attempt was, through my photographs, to try to create a vision of the premise that I was feeling at that time, that the American empire was wobbling, and who are the people being affected by this, and how do I show that? And so it's a wide range of different photographs. The book itself is divided into 6 different chapters. The beginning is kind of the topography of America, just giving you a visual sense of moments I've caught. Rural communities that are falling apart, that are depopulizing as people are moving from the rural communities and the farmland into the city, looking for a better life. And as well, very often what has happened is major highways have bypassed the cities, and where once the cities had people driving through and buying things, that's kind of disappeared. Looking at the kind of quirkiness of America and how people live. This is a limo driver in New York City. And so it's partly a story about who we are, what we look like, and of course, my own observations as I went on the road. Of course, Steve Jobs, this is in New York City. This is actually in Harlem. In this photograph, this is a sign on the top of a taxi cab. Chicago, public park, football game. This is a party before a football game. This is a homeless man in New York City, 26-degree weather, Fahrenheit. This is a man with one eye who is begging for money in Coney Island in New York City. This is a rock concert. Los Angeles. This is Halloween in wealthy suburban community. And partly what I wanted to do was as well show different parts of America and American culture. And so the work ended up being divided, as I said, into chapters, which seemed like the easiest way to show the work. And so what I wanted to do was to show the wealth. I wanted to show the heartland of America. I wanted to show the urban cities of America. And so this is the opening of the opera in San Francisco. This is a $10,000 a plate dinner. So to get admitted, each individual had to pay $10,000. And of course, Wall Street and the power of Wall Street and the growth of money. And the wealthy who are able to buy and rate and go to events like this equestrian festival in Wellington, Florida, where they have multiple horses, which they've paid over $1 million for each horse. And they have undocumented workers working to take care of the horses. Incredible display of wealth. It's in Chicago. This is the opening of the opera. Well, the opening of the opera. So the range of wealth in America is really pretty incredible. This is the auctioning of the Scream in New York at Sotheby's that sold for $120 million. The Polo Club. And then you move into the rural communities. And this is in Kansas. And the small towns. This is the mayor of this small rural town. And this is a July 4th celebration. And these are foreclosed homes because of the Great Recession that were left empty. And this is midnight in a club, in the Fiesta Club. Abandoned school in Mississippi. So prisoners in Mississippi. It's a county fair. It's a man in his home in Kansas with his gun. This is a food line in Utah. This is in Arkansas, father and son. It's a family on the road with all their possessions. And then I look at the urban environment and the life that people live in the urban environment. This is Los Angeles, waiting at a bus stop. This is Hollywood and Vine, Los Angeles. It's an abandoned apartment building in Detroit. This is Detroit dancing and begging for money at an intersection. This is in New York City, a homeless woman looking for cans to recycle on the street. Again, partly as a photographer, I'm looking for those kind of the intersection of people's lives, but also the somehow to witness the moment that we are in historically. So the fact that she, has pulled this top shop fashion publication out of the garbage can as she's looking, and behind her is an advertisement for Apple computers, is a moment in which you're kind of waiting for and really thinking very cautiously about how do you tell this story, but what are the other elements in the story? This is a parade. This is Park Avenue in New York City, wanted poster for a robber. This is a protest in the Bronx against the death of a young Black man who was killed by the police. And this is Hollywood and Vine, a handicapped man, cleaning the stars on the street for famous actors and actresses. A murder in Detroit. The county hospital, where if you don't have health insurance, you need to go, and this is the waiting room in the county hospital. It's graffiti in the New York City subway system. This is a homeless couple on the street in San Francisco with a drawing of the Scream on the back of their little encampment. This is a homeless veteran with all his medication in a homeless shelter in Texas. And a woman and her child panhandling, begging for money on a freeway exit in the Bay Area near San Francisco. This is a church food bank. And this is one of many new sites we see in America, just a huge increase of homeless people who are now living on the streets and setting up tents. You're talking about thousands and thousands of people. So this was, the work I just showed was really the early work done over about 5 years. And then all of a sudden, America began to shift. And of course, the election campaign happened and we elected Donald Trump unexpectedly, I think, for most of America. And we kind of dived into 4 years of extreme, harsh politics. And so I continued photographing. And it was just really fascinating as a social documentary photographer to have caught kind of the early parts of the American moment that I felt led to the election of Trump, which was, the falling apart of jobs and the technology change, where people were being thrown out of work because computers were taking over and automation and so forth. And so that gives you some sense of the project. I'm only showing a small part to give you a sense of what my work is about, how I see my process as a photographer is to really go to a community, drive around, walk around, really try to think about what my story is, what I'm trying to tell, what I'm trying to see, and intensely wait for moments. I mean, this is actually the last picture that will be in the book, and the new book has 209 photographs. I'm just showing you a small selection of those photographs. You know, often in photography, it's literally just a moment. I mean, this was an example where I was photographing in Detroit on the street, walking around, and all of a sudden I noticed this young Black man wearing this shirt with freedom on the background. And literally, in this particular moment, it's a very brief, you know, probably a 1 to 2 minute exchange. Often I will talk to people and ask permission. Sometimes it's just what I would call a grab photograph, a moment. It happens so quickly. And partly it for me, it's just all about keeping a mantra in my head as I'm working. You know, what is my story about? How will my viewer observe the moment I'm observing myself? But how does that observation of that moment translate to my viewer? So I'm always thinking about my viewer. I'm always thinking about the people who will be seeing my photographs. What will they take from that experience, the experience that I'm observing? And how do I then, as a photographer, using the tools we have, the camera, the angle, the focal length of the lens, the light, how can I use all those tools to create a moment that, to me, tells the story? Sometimes it's luck, you know. Sometimes it's patience. So I'm a photographer who has a lot of patience. I will often wait for, you know, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. If I just feel, I mean, a lot of times it's just a feeling that something will happen, a moment will happen. Sometimes I go very specifically to an event or an activity, knowing that that activity is important. So, for example, the earlier photographs I showed you of the opera in San Francisco, you know, that was an event that I needed to get permission and to get press credential to go to that event, knowing that there were going to be very wealthy people there. They were going to be decked out in, you know, dresses that cost, you know, $12,000 to $15,000, that they were paying $10,000 each to be at this event. So, you know, there's going to be an important part of your story there. And part of then is, you know, how do you get permission to do that? And that, for me, is part of the process. So it's a mix of very specifically finding moments that will be part of my story. And then it's the other part, which is just the chance, the chance moment that just kind of happens. I like to think, you know, the hand of God is there and you know, pushes you along, and everything just happens. So I'm still shooting film. I mean, I shoot digital, but most of my books, and this will be, this new book that I'm showing you now will be my 11th book. They're all shot with film. So I just really enjoy the process of using film, and I'm shooting, as you can see, it's a square. I'm shooting with a medium format camera, a Mamiya 6, which is like a very large, like a rangefinder. It's a rangefinder camera with a 50 millimeter lens. And I like the process of film because it's all still very mysterious to me, meaning that I can observe this moment that you're seeing right now, and it happens very, very quickly. And I may have only made 3 or 4 exposures, and I have no idea until I get back from my travels and develop the film and look at the film and make a contact sheet that maybe I actually got something. So there's partly the excitement of telling the story, but there's partly the mystery of the photograph itself, which I find really fun. So with this project, and with most of my projects, I go out for a number of weeks and photograph and come back and develop the film and make contact sheets and look at the contact sheets and begin to select photographs. And that process then informs going out again to photograph more and deciding where to photograph next. And as I'm working on a project, and as I said, this new project was done over 11 years, there were often times when photographs that I took at the very beginning of the project didn't seem that they were that significant. But then as I begin the process of editing and putting the photographs together and even sequencing the photographs that I initially didn't necessarily feel fit into the book or the project, all of a sudden they become part of the project. They take on a different meaning, particularly as you're sequencing and putting pictures next to each other and creating kind of a visual rhythm. So part of that visual rhythm is something that happens while I'm out photographing, and part of that visual rhythm is something that happens as I begin the editing process and I look at the work. And there's a lot of failures. I mean, I'm shooting hundreds of rolls of film, and to find a moment, to find a picture that you're really excited about, that you really feel fits into the story that you're trying to tell is really, for me, one of the great parts of being a photographer. And photography has just been an amazing opportunity for me to go out into the world and see the world, and an excuse. I mean, I'm curious about the world, and it's just a wonderful excuse to get out and see things on your own and not watch television or read it in the newspaper, but be there by yourself. So that's kind of a short overview of my work, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Professor Light, we have just started, we have just opened the chat box, and we have many questions pouring in. So before that, I would, as a teacher, and I have been following your work, listening to your talks, whether it was the mysteries of photography, the politics of seeing, all that. And that made me very eager to request you to please, if you could do a session for us. And it is truly, I have got to learn so much. But I wanted to ask, there's this whole culture which is developing all over the world. The photography culture is exploring, and everyone is trying different techniques. But when you teach to students, how do you make them aware of the culture of concerned photography? I mean, it's just being, it all have become so much of commercial that the aspect of concerned photography, how the photography developed through the, I want your insight on that how do you ignite that feeling of concerned photography in students?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, because it's funny. The beginning of my lecture, I showed you some of the photographers that influenced me, who are all concerned photographers. And it's really interesting. Often when I So I show a lot of PowerPoints of other photographers' work, and it's really interesting. A lot of times my students will say, oh, those are just old photographers.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, they are old photographers, but there is a canon in photography that was created since the first photograph. And every photographer has added in some way to that canon, and every photographer has taken from that canon and has added their own vision, their own eye to what it is they're trying to say. And I always think back to one of my good friends is the photographer Bill Owens, who did a book called Suburbia. And I remember in the 1970s when I started photographing agricultural workers, because I was really interested in that subject, and it had not, and the poverty and the conditions of agricultural work in America had not really changed, and there was a lot of child labor of children working in the fields, and no one really knew about it. I said to him I was doing this project, and he said to me, why? You can't make better pictures than Dorothea Lang. And it's true. I mean, she was this brilliant photographer that did that. But I try to explain to my students that every generation of photographer has to re-examine their world. And you can't worry whether or not, Ansel Adams did landscapes and you can't do better pictures than Ansel Adams. I mean, you have to bring your own voice to the pictures you make. And so in sharing the history of photography with my students, I try to explain that there is this body of work that informs us. And even though they may have not seen the work of Robert Frank, his photographs, they're influenced by Robert Frank because, advertising photographers, fashion photographers, cinematographers, all of our visual media, those people who are doing that media have been influenced by a photographer like Robert Frank or Gary Winogrand. And so you yourself, as a young photographer learning photography, unbeknownst to you, you have actually been already trained visually by, picking up a magazine or going to the cinema or looking at YouTube or, reading a fashion magazine. So partly it's putting that connection together. These are the people who have created powerful photographs that have lived way beyond they have themselves.
We have a lot of questions. We'll take. I'll ask you. You can unmute your mic. Shika, I would request you to ask your question. You can unmute yourself. And Shika, are you able to unmute yourself? I'll just quickly unmute you. Okay. There's one more question. Shika, I'll ask Shika's question. Professor, you said in one of your interview that it took some time, 3-4 years in completing documentaries. What keeps you motivating and consistent for doing such long project?
It's a couple things. I just really are fascinated by the subject that I'm looking at, and so I'm very fortunate that I don't have to answer to an editor, for example, who says, why are you still doing this? So I'm just I have my own energy of looking at a story and exploring it, and so I'm both fascinated by trying to understand whatever the story is I'm doing, but also trying to make better photographs, and that I've been doing this for over 50 years. And so, it's pretty easy when you're starting out because it's all new, but the longer you do it, the more difficult it is in some ways to break out of your own little visual box that you feel very comfortable with. You have a style. So partly is within that 3 or 4 years of doing a project, it's both trying to fully understand the story, but also to become a better photographer and make different images. And so each project is challenging to me and exciting. I mean, it's just really exciting. And I really love being out making pictures. I like the process of developing the film and the process of working in the darkroom and editing and then putting a book together. I mean, it's just the whole package. And I like the idea that I have a voice. I think this is really important in social photography. So much around us is unseen and untold. And particularly in the United States now, where large corporations control the media, and you know, their voices don't necessarily reach beyond their own political interests. As a photographer with a camera, and you know, you can go out and you can have a voice. And I think you know, the challenge of having a voice is getting your work out into the world so people can see it, and that definitely is a challenge. But you know, one of the great things of the technological revolution is you can have a website and people can see your work. You can put it online. You can, I mean, here I am, here we are. You're in India, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we're having this conversation, and that is, you know, is really wonderful.
So I'll just, there's so many questions. I'll take one more question. We have a question from Simon Verghese, who is from Bangalore, National School of Journalism, Bangalore, the other part of India. Good evening, Professor Ken. Where that occasion when the subject was not, where was that occasion when the subject was not aware of being photographed? How natural were they while being photographed? Yeah, so his question is, when you were photographing, how natural were they? Did they, do you, like, you know, because I think most of them, they face this thing that, you know, that how do you shoot them, that natural expression? Yeah, yeah.
Well, one is watching really closely, you know, and I think often what can happen with photographers, I find this with my students a lot, they become so, when they're in a situation with someone they want to photograph, they become so interested in the person's story as the person's telling the story, they forget they're a photographer and they just want to listen. So I've really learned that when I'm talking with someone in particular, I'm really watching very, very closely, and I'm photographing as I'm talking to them. Sometimes it's just that moment in which I'm just looking very carefully, and there's just a split second. I'm very conscious of their body language, and I'm thinking about, how do I capture this moment? Again, I'm always thinking about my audience, not about myself, but what is the photograph going to look like? I mean, a lot of photographers talk about pre-visualization and visualization and the mind's eye, and I'm actually, when I'm photographing, I'm actually seeing in my head what that picture is going to look like. And because I have film, I can't turn to the back of the camera and see, did I get it? I mean, I have to really be much more intense. Sometimes you just have to say to people, ignore me. Sometimes they don't even see you, and sometimes you just have to have a conversation and explain to them what you're doing and why you want to observe them and why it's important to make a photograph.
Professor Ken, we'll take one more question from Shalu. Good evening, sir. Which is your favorite project till now, and what inspired you to work on such specific topic?
You know, my favorite project is always the one I've just finished. So I'm very, very excited about this new book that Steidl's published in Course of the Empire, mainly because it's done over 11 years, which is the longest period I've worked on a project. And because the story for me is so much about my country right now and what has happened and the aftermath. I mean, the beginning and the lead into, you know, this, the tragedy of the presidentship of Donald Trump and what happened to America, and the aftermath now that we're still facing, that's, you know, the division of America. But, you know, all the books have different meanings. My last book, Midnight La Frontera, which is my night photographs that I took along the border in the 80s, is just a beautiful, beautiful book. I mean, physically beautiful book. And it was so much fun working with the publisher, which is a publisher called TBW. Their care of working with me and creating this really wonderful document was, you know, really was a great experience. So, you know, each project has led me to another project. I don't know, I could say this is my favorite project. I mean, they're all exciting.
Professor Ken, I think Jen sir has one question.
Sure.
Yeah. It's a very interesting and it's inspiring to see the different sides of the United States, because when we heard about the United States, it's always we are remembering the glittering light, the high-rise building, the elegant lifestyles. But when you have portrayed some and captured some visuals, it is a different side of the United States. So I'm very curious and interesting to know that how do you choose your subject and what kind of relationship you develop with your subject?
So sometimes my subjects pick me. They see me, they come up to me. And sometimes I'm just out wandering around. Sometimes I'm driving my car. There was a photograph, for example, of two women. Well, the opening photograph I showed was the person on the horseback with the American flag. And then there was a second picture of these two women at a county fair. I mean, literally that was taken at the end of the day of being on the road, driving in Indiana. And, you know, I'm looking for a hotel to stay in for the night. It's during the summer. It's still light out. It's 7 o'clock. I'm tired because I've been photographing all day long. And all of a sudden I'm driving and I see a sign on the side of the road that says County Fair. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm tired, but I should see what this is about. And, you know, literally it's not on my agenda. I have no idea what I'm going to discover there. I pull off the road, I go in, and I spend 2 hours at this county fair. And all of a sudden in the book, there's 2 photographs from that moment. And the moment was completely unexpected. So partly as a photographer, I think you have to be open to the moment. You have to definitely be focused in finding things and knowing where you're going. But when you get there, you shouldn't be so focused on, you know, what you thought you originally were going to photograph. I mean, I often tell my students, if you get an assignment to photograph an event, you always want to show up an hour before and you always want to stay an hour later, because the photograph may not be right at the event. It may be something that happens before or something that happens after. And for me, very often it's before or after. The event may be just what brings people together.
Very insightful, Professor. Thank you.
Yeah. So we'll take one question from Raghav. Raghav, you can unmute yourself. I think the unmute thing is on. Okay, Raghav doesn't have his mic is not working. Okay, I'll ask your question.
And I'm good. I have no timeline. I'm good to take as many questions as you guys feel comfortable with.
Professor Ken, Professor Devakis is also here. So you, yeah. Okay. So we'll continue with the next question. In the big pile of photographs taken today, there's a fog of commercial photographs, and we seem to be losing the craft of photography, especially prints and composition. And photographs today are turning into romanticized and escapist media.
Yes.
What are your views on this?
Yes, there's a whole school of photographers who are, I don't know, I hate to say afraid to go out into the world for whatever reason, and create what look like documentary photographers, but they're actually like a Hollywood set. I mean, they're directed by the photographer and they're not the real world. And I don't know, I find that really sad. I don't like that kind. I mean, some of it's really beautiful and very, very well done, but it's not authentic. And I'm always thinking about, you know, the authentic nature of photography, which I think is one of the most important things. And of course, people might say, well, it's not authentic. You go out, you know, maybe you wait till a cloudy day to go out and to photograph, and you know, you choose a certain lens and you crop it a certain way. And, you know, there's a whole conversation about what is truth, you know, and all I can say is, you know, I try to witness my world around me and in my own country, and the truth that I create is what I feel and what I witness.
So we have a question from Poonam. Poonam, would you like to unmute yourself? Poonam?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, please go ahead.
You seem to be mentioning a lot about your students, so you
Yes.
seem very happy too. So you were 18 when you started photography, and now you teach the students of the same age as you were. So does
Yes.
that bring back memories?
It does at times. Yes, it does. Particularly, I would say in the last year when we've had this turmoil of Black Americans being shot by the police and intense protests, and we also, like you, had the COVID pandemic, and so here I was as an older photographer who started their career photographing students' reaction to government power back in 1970, and now there's a whole younger generation out there photographing. And I felt, because of the pandemic, I felt I can't go out. I'm an older photographer. I'm very successful. I could get COVID and die. There was no vaccination yet. So it was. I can tell you, the pull to go out and photograph was so great, but I couldn't do it. But part of it was knowing that there was a younger generation of photographers that were out there that were doing what I had done 50 years ago. And so that was very, very exciting to see them out doing it. They were, they felt they could take the risk and tell the story of their moment in time. And that's how it should be. I think every generation of photographers has to witness their own world. And one of the great things that's happening in photography, it used to be, and I talk to my students about this a lot, it used to be that white men were sent all over the world as photographers. And so if there was a story in India, it was not photographed by an Indian photographer. It was a white man who Newsweek magazine would send, or Time magazine, or the New York Times would send to photograph India. And what do they know about India? Nothing. I mean, they know about India what they see on television, which is not really what India is about. So one of the great things for students is that world has really changed, and you are able, as Indian photographers, to tell your own story. And that's why I've focused in my country, because it's what I know. I know about the culture, I know about the language. I also can push back against the myths that are out there. And so this is partly what is important for young photographers to understand. You actually have a responsibility to tell the story of your own world in a way that you understand.
We'll have one last question. Kushi, are you there? I mean, would you like to unmute and ask? I also.
Yes.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
What is the one thing you wish you knew when you started taking photos?
The one thing I knew that, well, I just love taking pictures. My dad was an amateur photographer, and so I just loved interacting. I loved the creative feeling of making a picture, of the interaction, of the power of the camera. And then for me, my earliest pictures, I showed a couple that I did in 1970 as an 18-year-old photographer. A few of those photographs were published all over the world in publications, and I was kind of like, wow, you can have a voice. I mean, you can have a very, very powerful voice as a photographer if you want to. And that at 18 was like that. What, it was a moment for me, that you're not simply in a crowd. You can actually stand out if you really work hard and you really practice your craft and you learn your craft, and you don't give up. I mean, that's the hardest part, is not giving up. and realizing it's not an easy path to be a photographer. It's not an easy path to be a journalist. There's a lot of powers that don't want voices to be heard.
It's 9 o'clock.
And that is so important to, push forward.
Professor Light, Professor Devakar sir has a question. Sir, would you please unmute yourself?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Professor. It's such an amazing session, as Professor Jain said. And I was looking at the chat box. There's so many interesting questions, and it's a sad thing that we cannot continue the entire night. But I just want to ask you 2 questions, and I'm asking on behalf of 2 other students out here.
Yes.
One question is, Lavanya Rana says, which is the most interesting region in America to photograph? I know you have your shot over US, but which is, if you had to choose?
I really like the South, the American South, a lot. There's just a lot to see, a lot to tell. There's a lot of magic there. I mean, magic, as you know, is part of photography. Things just happen right in front of you. You pick up your camera and all of a sudden a bird flies into your frame, or someone walks into your frame, and it's unexpected. And I find there's a lot of that in the South. I really like photographing there.
Oh, that's great. There's another question, asked by Deven Pratap Singh. And his point is that, nowadays you see a lot of photographers adding so much color to it, using a lot of Photoshop, and actually at point of time also destroying the soul of the photograph.
Yeah.
So what is your take on excessive use of Photoshop and editing?
Yeah, I'm not very good at Photoshop, so it's lucky. And I'm still working in the darkroom. So I'm a true believer in, the simple things of burning and dodging, and making sure the color's right. But when you start enhancing things and changing things, it's not real to me. And I know there's been a lot of controversy about it. I know World Press Photo every year, seems like in the last many years, has had these big fights where photographers have over photoshopped, and people like them at first, and then they're like, wait a minute, this isn't really real. It's altered, and they get kicked out of the contest. So I think minimal alteration is where I'm at.
Right. Professor,
there's a difference between social documentary photography and art.
Absolutely.
And there has to be a line.
Absolutely correct. Very true. Professor, there's also one more thing which is raging the world over. In fact, is this challenge of this fake news and facts being twisted across the media world, actually.
Yeah.
And often we see a lot of tools being deployed to check on the credibility of the news itself, and the credibility of. In that context, the photojournalism also is facing a lot of challenges. So how do you look at this particular challenge, which the photojournalists are facing the maximum, and the credibility at times goes down and up?
Yeah, it is a problem, and there is definitely the issue of people wanting to win awards, and I want to have a better picture, and I need to do this, and they're changing things, and I think partly it's just being conscious of your own way of being in the world, and trying to be truthful and observational. And I mean, photography is really tricky, as you know. From one minute to the next, a person could look sad and a person could look very happy. I always think of Diane Arbus. There's a famous picture she took of the boy with the hand grenade in Central Park, which is one of her, very famous photographs. And I often show my students that contact sheet, and, it's 12, she was shooting medium format, and there's 12 pictures. And the boy looks very happy, except for that one frame where he has this crazy, insane look holding the hand grenade. And of course, that's the picture she chose. That moment happened, right? So, partly for me, the editing part is, what is my experience of the moment? What am I observing, and what am I looking for, and what am I trying to tell? it can be very non-objective. I mean, a person might look at the picture and say, that's really not who I am, but yeah, that's the picture I chose.
So thank you so much from my side, Ken. I think it's been brilliant. Shraddha, I would definitely request before you close to request everyone to put their videos on and take a good photograph with Professor Ken. I think to have him around with us is a blessing.
Thank you.
Shraddha, please unmute yourself.
This is the famous word all over the room, all over the world. It doesn't matter. Mute yourself, right?
Professor, we have a lot of questions, and it shows that a lot of students are very inspired and excited to ask you the question. Whether we don't know that, do you have a time to respond those questions or not?
I'm happy to stay on. It's your.
Oh, that's
I'm happy to
that's really wonderful.
It would be great. If Shraddha ma'am, if you allow me, then I will take a couple of questions because there are a lot of good questions there in the chat box.
Sure, sir. Definitely.
Okay. Dr. Anurag Sahu, he wants to know that is there any concept called street portrait in street photography?
Yeah. Well, at least here we have a whole group of people who see themselves as street photographers. And I like to think of, Gary Winogrand is, the American photographer we most often think in the United States as a street photographer. There are others, but his whole world was just going out onto the street and photographing the interaction of people that had nothing. I mean, the story was the moment he captured. It was very different than my work in which I'm looking at a subject, whether it's, inmates on death row, or it's agricultural workers, or communities, rural Mississippi, where I'm actually photographing a community, and I have a theme or a subject. His subject is just human interaction on the street. So absolutely, there's a whole class of people that just love finding those quirky moments where someone, there's a second where there's an interaction that makes for a really interesting photograph. And I do some of that myself. I mean, Robert Frank, did a lot. Robert Frank had a theme, but, a lot of people, the theme is the street.
So, if you'd allow, I wanted to ask one question from Professor Light. So, Professor Light, I have seen, when I was reading your work, and as you said in one of your talks that you are inspired by Dorothea Lang's work. Yeah, yes. And in our class also, we had been discussing Dorothea's work and especially the photograph which you mentioned, the Migrant Mother.
Yes.
So I want to understand what was the photograph and which was the thing which inspired you the most from Dorothea's work?
She had a way of finding a moment and a gesture that caught the universal person. So it's interesting with the Migrant Mother, it was decades and decades after she made that photograph that people actually learned who was the Migrant Mother. She was the every woman of the Great Depression. She represented that moment, that horrible moment in the Great Depression in which people were thrown out of work and impoverished and could not afford to live. And she was really unknown, but the picture was universal. And it was, as I said, decades and decades later that Florence Thompson was identified as the Migrant Mother, who wasn't that happy with the photograph, and that can often happen. But it represented a universal experience, both an experience people didn't want to have, like, oh my God, I don't want that to happen to me, or the experience of how could we let this happen, or the experience of, yes, I had that experience. I mean, that's what makes a great photograph. And she just did it over and over again, which is remarkable.
Okay, we'll just take one last question, which is by Poonam again. She wants to ask, does your students inspire you now? Does their work inspire you now? Because you've done so much. Does your students inspire you?
Yes, they do. In fact, it's really fun being in the classroom, and it's really fun seeing students work who's really great and thinking, oh my God, I better go out and make better pictures. I have to keep working. I have to keep up with them. They're so good. And so it is inspiring to be in the classroom.
All right. Thank you so much, sir.
My pleasure.
For such an insightful session. We have less time. I'll quickly ask everyone to please switch on your webcam so that we can take a photograph with Professor Light. Please, if you could switch on. Yeah, that's great. So we have a wide audience today. I'll have to take 2-3 shots, and then I'll have to. Yeah, everyone, if you could look at the camera. This is a photography session. We want you to look at the camera, and this is going to be a nice virtual web shot which we would be taking. Yeah.
Excuse me, ma'am. Sorry, there is no any light, so I can't open my camera.
All right. Okay.
It's okay.
All right. Just one more shot. Okay, one last. All right. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
A lot. This was indeed a very insightful session. We have learned, through your work, of course, you have taken us through a journey, the picture, which we had been seeing and trying to understand the work about different photographers, how to develop a more concerned photography culture. I'm surely, sir, thanks a lot. It has been a great